guys, it's Jake, just taking a minute today to talk through some of the basic tackle that we use for our inshore fishing in and around Tampa Bay. So this is kind of part two of this basic tackle talk. I talked through rods and reels in a previous video. I'll post a link to that at the end of this one. But in this video, I just wanted to go through basic terminal tackle. So once you've got a rod and reel, what do you want to spool that rod up with? What does your leader look like? Hooks, bobbers, weights, those kind of things. So we kind of talk through basic rod and reel setups, and we'll kind of go with this this first kind of entry-level setup that we talked about. So this is a Penn 4000 series reel matched with a Fate 7-foot Fate green rod, and so I'm going to spool this with 20-pound braid. Now here's why. 20-pound braid is really versatile because it's thin enough that you can cast it a long way. It's got a nice thin diameter. So if you're fishing on the flats and you're just casting all day with jigs or top waters or whatever you want, you can still cast 20 pound a long way, but it's got a lot of tensile strength. So if you're fishing around mangroves or around docks and you want something that you can kind of still put a little bit of heat on the fish to pull it away from structure, 20 pound is kind of a happy medium that we've found. So you can throw 10-pound braid if you have a rod that you're only going to use on the flats. You know you're going to fish it around structure. 10 pound gives you plenty of strength to fight even a big bull red, as long as you're not getting around structure. Definitely fine for trout, those kind of things on the flats. But if you want a rod and reel that's going to be versatile, that you can use around structure and also on the flats, 20 pounds is a happy medium. So for Braid Line, there's a lot of different brands. I'm sure they all make great products. Power Pro is something that we typically use and has been great for us. This line never breaks on its own. Usually if we've got it wrapped around something or we're just putting too much heat on a fish, is the only time that we see this braid break. But even then, it's always going to break at the leader. This braid stands up great, but it's got a really thin diameter. It's easy to cast. Doesn't get wind knots very often. Power Pro kind of was the leader in getting into Braid Line and inventing this series of lines. So they're kind of industry leader. I like a high visibility line, so I had this yellow spooled on most of my reels. You know, the braid line is never going to be presented to the fish. Fish, you know, are much less likely to feed if they can see that braid line, but that's why we tie a fluorocarbon leader on. So I'm usually fishing with fluorocarbon leader, and that's kind of what I wanted to talk about next, is leader line that we use. And for leader line, I typically use Berkeley Vanish fluorocarbon leader. And so that's what's being presented to the fish, and they're not seeing the braid lines. That's why I like to fish with something high visibility, because that way I can see my braid line jump across the water if a fish hits it. It gives me just an extra cue to know what's going on with my bait in the water. So that's why I like a high visibility line. So for the leader, the fluorocarbon leader, that's your clear strip that you're going to use at the end to tie to your bait. And that gives you something that the fish is not going to see. You can present that bait, make it look natural. So if you're fishing for fish that don't have abrasive teeth, trout, redfish, things like that, jacks, you can go with a lighter fluorocarbon leader and typically draw more strikes. So for trout fishing, I like to use 15 pound. You can even use 10 pound, but 15 is kind of a good medium that I found that I don't break off with trout ever really with 15-pound tests. So it's a good light line. You draw more strikes the lighter you can go with your line. Typically the rule is you only go as heavy as you have to go to not break off. So for trout and redfish, open areas, not trying to get away from structure, 15 pounds fine. Now with snook, they have abrasive sandpaper teeth. So you need more weight on that fluorocarbon leader because the fish is going to be chafing against it. If you use 20 pound or less, that snook's going to chafe through it almost every time, unless you just hook it right in the corner of the mouth with that circle hook and get lucky. So I like to use 25 to 30 pound tests for snook. If I'm fishing for grown snook, I'll up it to 40. Or fishing around structure, you know, I'll stay up in that 40 pound range. You typically may get a few less bites, but when you get that bite, you're going to have what you need to be able to withstand the battle and get that fish landed without chafing through your leader. Because that's a bummer. You fight a real nice fish for a few minutes and then it chafes through your leader. So with fluorocarbon leader, typically like to use somewhere between 15 and 30, unless I'm fishing for big snook, big girls, and we'll go up to 40. So then you get down to at the end of that fluorocarbon leader. So you've got your rod spooled up with 150 or 200 yards of braided line, whatever kind of fits on the spool to get it within about an 1/8 inch of the end of the spool. You've got that spooled up. Now you've tied on your leader line. A lot of people will use at least 18 inches to 2 feet. I like to use more than that. I use like 3 to 5 feet. I'm not sure, but I feel like it gives me more strikes, keeps the braid away from the presentation of the bait, and so I usually use 3 to 5 feet. So you're at the end of that fluorocarbon now. What are you tying on? So if you're using lures, that's where you tie on your lure, throw a nice wrap a little loop knot on there, let that lure work naturally. So that's where you're going to throw your lure on. But for what we do a lot of live bait fishing. If you've watched any of our videos, so for live bait fishing, we're always going to use a circle hook. So circle hooks are a big invention in the fishing world that has helped save a lot of fish. Typical J hooks will get down in the fish's gut, down in the fish's gills, cause a lot of problems. These circle hooks are designed. They have a curve at the tip that keeps them from getting hooked when a fish takes it down deep until it gets to the corner of their mouth. So it kind of rolls around the edge of their mouth and then hooks in right there. Advantage of that being, you don't really have to set the hook. You just have to pull tight on the fish and kind of make sure that you get enough pressure on the fish to be able to push that hook through, but you don't have to throw a big jerk and pull that hook through, because it's going to pull right to the side of the mouth. So majority of the time you're going to get that fish right in the mouth, not injure it, not get hooks down in its gut and its gills and those kind of things, which is great for catch and release fishing. For circle hooks, I love to use these Owner Mutu light wire hooks. So these provide you the right size to match with your live bait, but they're thin wire, so to me they're not obstructive. They don't look awkward hanging off of a fish and kind of spook that fish away when it's looking at it. So kind of a good medium for fishing for all species is this 2-0. You can fish for snook, trout, redfish, jacks, any of that with this 2-0. Now if you're getting into bigger snook, I'd up it to a 4-0 hook. But again, you want to match your bait. So if you're fishing with a little 2-inch greenback, then go with a 2-0 or a 1-0 hook. Even if you're fishing for bigger fish, because if you hang a big 6-0 hook off of that, the bait's not going to look natural at all. You're not going to draw many strikes. So bigger baits, that's when you can throw on a 4-0 or a bigger hook. Now if you're fishing for tarpon, something like that, you're going to want to use like a 5-0, 6-0, even up to an 8-0 hook, and pair it with bigger baits. So circle hooks are great. I know Pat likes to use the Mustad Demon circle hooks. They're great too. I just like these light wire because I think they're a little bit thinner. You be the judge who catches more fish. So I've also got kind of an example of something else that we may do if we're not just free lining that bait. So if you're free lining, that just means you have braid tied to your fluorocarbon that's just to a free hook, and you're letting that bait swim naturally. So when it's doing that, you just want to kind of give it line in order for that fish to swim naturally. Now if you want a little bit of an indicator to see what your bait's doing, or you're trying to draw attention to your bait, we like to use these popping corks. There's a bunch of different brands of them. This particular one is Cajun Thunder. It's been used a little bit, so it's a little bit bent, but these popping corks do a couple things for you. One, they're a good indicator for what's going on with your bait. So sometimes you're fishing around mangroves and things like that. You want something up on the surface to be able to see when that fish strikes. That way you can get on it before it gets too deep into mangroves. But also, when you pop these things, they kind of generate what sounds like a strike on the surface. So it makes fish curious. It draws them in. This is especially effective for trout fishing on the flats, redfish, things like that. A lot of people in Louisiana for red fishing use these popping corks. So what you'll do is you'll tie that popping cork to you can tie it straight to your braid if you want, because you're kind of presenting this fluorocarbon leader, but if you have a leader on there already, you can tie it to the fluorocarbon. And then you want your weights at the bottom, and anywhere between 24 to 30 inches of leader line tied to your circle hook. And now you're just going to throw that out there and just pop it every once in a while to draw some attention to your bait. When that bobber goes under, real tight, pull up, and you'll be hooked up. So that's something else that's useful for trout, redfish, and snook. Now if you're dropping down your baits, if you're trying to get on some snapper, some small grouper in the bay, things like that, that's when you're going to want to add a weight to your line. And you can do that a couple different ways. You can either do what's called a Carolina rig, where you tie the weight between a swivel and your leader line a few feet up, and that gives you some line in between the weight and your bait. That's useful for bottom fishing, but also for redfish if you just want to keep your bait closer to the bottom. Throwing a Carolina rig on there is useful. for the weight size that you're going to use. We like to use egg sinkers. You want to use the least amount of weight that you need to get your bait on the bottom. So if you're fishing in 25 feet of water, trying to get down to the bottom for snapper, there's no tide, no flow, just throw a little half-ounce weight on there, or even a quarter ounce, just something that's going to get it down to the bottom and not obstruct what that fish looks like. Let it still look natural down there. And if you're on the flats, fishing for redfish, and you just want a Carolina rig to hold it down on the bottom, just use a half-ounce or a 1 ounce weight. Now, if you're dropping down for a grouper, now the current's flowing, you need your bait to kind of stay in that one spot without getting swept off. That's when you can go up to a 1 ounce, 1.5 ounce, 2 ounce, whatever you need to keep it on the bottom. So just use the least amount of weight that you can to keep your bait on the bottom. For snapper and grouper fishing inside the bay, you'll see us use shotgun rigs a lot. So as opposed to the Carolina rig, where you have a few feet of line between your hook and your swivel, and you put the weight above it so that the weight stays away from the hook. With a shotgun rig, that weight's going to slide all the way down to the hook. So basically, you're just going to, before you tie your hook on, throw this egg sinker on your line. The line's going to flow right through the egg sinker. Then you tie your circle hook on, and that weight's going to drop all the way to your hook. Now when you drop this down, you want to drop it down until it hits the bottom. Now you've got your hook right next to your egg sinker, and you want to leave a little bit of slack so that bait can naturally swim away from your egg sinker. So now your bait's swimming around that egg sinker, and when it gets hit, you'll still feel it because the line's just flowing through that sinker freely. So you'll still feel it, set the hook, same as the Carolina would be when you get it in. So that's just a kind of brief talk about the things that we typically use. I'd say 75-80% of the time we're fishing free line for inshore species, but when we're dropping it down, that's when we throw a weight on, or when we're fishing on the flats for trout or fishing around mangroves and just want a better indicator of what our bait's doing, that's when we'll throw on something like a popping cork. So hope that helps. Just to review, kind of basic inshore setup: 20-pound test braid tied to leader of your choosing based off of the fish that you're fishing for. 30-pound is a good safe bet if you're fishing around any structure or fishing for snook. You can go to 15 or 20 pound if you're fishing for non-toothy critters around the flats when you're out away from structure. If you're trying to up it and go for bigger fish, you can go to 40-pound braid and tie it to a stronger leader, like 40-pound leader. So this would be a good rod for snook if you're doing that. Fishing for tarpon, you can go up to 50 or 60-pound leader with this bigger rod that we talked about earlier. You get a 40-pound braid to your thicker 40 to 60-pound leader, and then with this other big boy that we talked about in the previous video, if you're dropping down for big grouper and you want something solid that you can pull it away from, this is 50-pound braid, and then we would tie that to 50 or 60-pound leader line to be able to put a lot of heat on the fish. So just to talk through the basic line, leader, hooks, weights, bobbers, those kind of things. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. If you have any questions about rods and reels, you can check out that video, and we'll see you out there. So tight lines, guys. We'll see you on Tampa Bay.